That things that used to work in the past don't work as well now because the world has changed. And one of the things that has changed is the way we have to treat and care for our veterans. The truth is that from these latest wars, you now have men and women that have survived attacks that no one has ever survived. But they will require long-term care on behalf of a grateful nation. You have people that have lost limbs. You have people that have suffered brain injury as a result of explosives nearby. You have people that have literally survived injuries that once killed you in the battlefield, and we are grateful for those advances in battlefield medicine. But it also places upon us a very significant obligation, and that is to care for them. And we are seeing the results of this system's failure, not just in our VA system, but in the homelessness rate among veterans. Just this weekend, we had a Lincoln Day dinner in Miami. We had a table full of homeless veterans spanning 3 separate conflicts. It's heartbreaking to see these men, they were all men, who served our country so admirably, so honorably, now have nowhere to live. We also have an obligation to help integrate returning veterans back into the workforce. I believe that there are skills that you acquire in the military that should immediately qualify you for college credit. For example, if you have served 2 tours of duty in Iraq, we should not force you to sit in a classroom and be lectured to on Middle Eastern affairs by someone who's never been there. If you used to transport high explosives on dangerous roads through the mountains of Afghanistan, I think you're qualified to haul eggs on the interstate highway system of the United States. I want to get to your question, so let me close with something we did about a month ago. My brother-in-law one of my brother-in-laws is a Marine, I say a Marine, he reminds me there is no such thing as a former Marine. There's a Marine that now wears a uniform and a Marine that's no longer in uniform but is still a Marine. And he's got the tattoos to prove it. He's a firefighter now. And so he signed up to be an escort in one of the honor flights. It's the first honor flight that had flown out of Miami International Airport. And we went to the airport that night to greet them upon their return. There were a significant number of World War II vets on that honor flight. In fact, there was a Pearl Harbor survivor among them. And I decided to take my children because this was the weekend right after Memorial Day. And they had just watched a series on World War II on one of the History channels. And they were fascinated by it. What a different time and a different place where so many people had to serve our nation. Different from today where we have a volunteer force. And my girls were there too, but my boys stood with me in the front. And they were so impressed and overwhelmed by the ability to thank these men and women. There were women who were part of the honor flight as well, for the service they provided to our country. But what most touched me was the veterans. They didn't know that there would be 1,000 people waiting for them at the airport. Many of them were completely overwhelmed by the response that they just couldn't believe it. When they got out of the airplane, that all these people were there waiting for them. They had left at 4 o'clock in the morning on that flight, spent a full day in Washington, D.C., had flown back, and they were overcome. But the one that really impressed me was a 90-year-old veteran who refused the wheelchair. He said, no, I walked on this plane, I'm going to walk on. And it reminds us of the value of that generation and those that followed and served our country. What they did on behalf of this nation. We take those political freedoms for granted. I believe as a nation we sometimes forget that the freedoms that we enjoy here are still rare in much of the world. That in many parts of this world, there are not just societies where people are economically constrained. There are societies where people are politically constrained. Even as I speak to you now, there are people in jail in Caracas, Venezuela, in Tehran, in Moscow, in Beijing, in Havana, in multiple places, and they are in jail for one simple reason. They do not agree with their government. And that is an issue we have never had to face, and certainly in my lifetime in this country, and in the lifetime of everybody in this room. That was not an accident. That was a choice that was made by the people that were here before us. And that was a right that was protected by generation after generation who confronted evil and challenges to that liberty throughout our history. We as a nation have an obligation to remind future generations that, as Ronald Reagan once said, liberty and freedom is only one generation from being lost. And that each generation has an obligation to protect it, to confront whatever the challenges may be of their particular time, and ensure that freedom survives for the next generation to inherit. And so as we talk about these issues today, we are reminded that what we are doing is we are discussing how this nation expresses its gratitude for the men and women who made an event like this possible. So I want to thank you for the invitation to be a part of it. I look forward to talking to you about some of the proposals that we're exploring and working on, and I am grateful and honored that you would have me here today. Thank you very much. This is good, the water's nearby. It's kind of I got both a cup and a bottle.
We know our senator here. Speaking of, so you mentioned the New York Times and the report. Speaking of the New York Times, they did some groundbreaking reporting recently.
Yeah.
They did. Apparently, your family recently purchased a luxury speedboat. Now, I've seen a photo of this boat, and I'm from Minnesota. You guys are New Hampshire. It looked a little bit like a fishing boat to me.
Yeah.
The veterans really want to know, why didn't you buy a yacht large enough to land a Black Hawk on?
I couldn't find anyone.
No, I'm just kidding.
Well, but the thing about the boat is, too, it is a luxury speedboat, but it is cleverly disguised as a fishing boat. But the best answer I got is someone who emailed me or texted me and said, any boat where you have to go to the bathroom off the side of the boat is not a luxury speedboat.
Here. Well, if they're out for you, it's probably for the right reasons, so we're grateful that you're here. But the New York Times really did have a report early this week that talked about how wait times are up 50%. We've spent billions more at the Department of Veterans Affairs. Wait times yet have accelerated for veterans trying to access VA care. Simple question veterans of all generations want answered. Why doesn't the VA work the way it should?
Well, first of all, it's a broken bureaucratic system. The system itself, the structure of it is broken. And that's one of the things that we've talked about in one of your proposals bring forward is, does the structure work in the 21st century, particularly at a time where a veteran may be living just a few blocks away from a high quality facility that can take them right away, that can provide treatment for them right away. Why should they have to wait 6 months to be seen at a VA if there's a hospital or private provider nearby that is able to see them immediately? At the end of the day, it requires us, well,
and certainly here in New Hampshire, where there isn't
a full-time, and it reminds us, the reason why we have a VA is not to have a VA. The reason why we have a VA is to serve veterans. And so we should have a system that serves veterans as quickly and in the highest quality possible. But here's the second point. Bureaucracies do not like competition. And I don't mean to besmirch everyone at the VA. I tell you, there are a lot of people that work there, particularly at the ground level, the nurses, the doctors, these are good people. But the bureaucracy in and of itself never likes competition. There is no government bureaucracy that wants you to have a choice not to be able to use them, whether that's at the state level, the local level, or the federal level. And they're resistant to these changes. And I think there is a deliberate effort to slow down this process and not to make it work. And that's why I think it's important for the Secretary to have the right to fire people that aren't doing their jobs, which is why we filed that bill that passed last year, and it's why we're going to, God willing, pass the bill this year that gives the Secretary the ability to fire someone in the VA who isn't doing their job. That's what happens everywhere else.
Simply through tactics. We need a strategic approach to ISIS that allows us to work in concert with our Sunni allies in the region, the Egyptians, the Jordanians, the Saudis, the Gulf kingdoms, all of whom have an interest in defeating radical jihadists as well. And coming up with a concise strategy that involves more commitment on their part to ground troops to ensure that we can defeat these groups before they continue to grow into new areas of influence. The second threat in that region is Iran's ambitions. Iran wants to become the dominant regional power. They see themselves as establishing a Shia arc throughout the region, and they're well on their way towards achieving that. They are now the most powerful political influence in Baghdad, in Lebanon, in Syria, obviously in Iran, and they're now meddling in Yemen and in Bahrain. That is also a threat that our Sunni allies have in common and that we need to confront as well. Embedded in that whole Middle Eastern threat is the fact that there is only one pro-American, free enterprise democracy in the Middle East, and that's the State of Israel. And we need to do everything we can to ensure that they are safe and can prosper. And then, the other threat is in Europe, where for over 2 decades now, NATO has largely become an expeditionary force, and many of the nations there stopped investing in the ability to protect their own countries from a foreign invasion because no one thought there was a threat. Well, there is, and his name is Vladimir Putin, a man who wants to be the leader of a great nation. He cannot achieve that economically because the Russian economy is equivalent to the size of the Italian economy. The only way he can achieve that is through military dominance. And his message is, any nation in our periphery that turns towards the West and turns towards Europe, we will take measures against you. In the case of Ukraine, we know what those measures are. But they're also involved in propaganda and also involved in all sorts of funding to help separatist groups in Moldova and in other countries that are former Soviet republics to undermine their governments as well. And so that poses a challenge, and that is, how can we reinvigorate NATO in the 21st century to confront the threat of Putin? And part of that requires a recommitment on our part to reinstall the defense mechanisms that we pulled out of the Czech Republic and Poland.
So, as we've seen with this current administration's national security strategy, you've seen a lot of putting the strategy after funding and other things happening before a coherent strategy, or no strategy, as we've seen in many places. You just talked about the biggest threats, which should be the leading discussion before you start talking about capabilities and reforms. What needs to happen in our Defense Department or with our military today, specifically the Pentagon, in order to prepare our armed forces to meet the threats you just outlined?
Part of it is the capability. In essence, your military funding should always be driven not simply by your immediate threats, but what the threats are going to look like in 15, 20, or 25 years. And we need to make those decisions in light of the fact that Russia and China are modernizing their nuclear stockpile. China's investing heavily in anti-access technologies, basically the ability to push the U.S. Navy further and further away from the Asia-Pacific region because of the threat of destroying our ships. They're investing heavily in cyber technology. They're investing heavily in space weapons, basically the ability to shoot down our satellites, because if they can blind us, if they can knock out satellites, they take away our technological edge. Then we have a secondary threat in that is, how can we quickly embed special operators to take on a radical jihadist group and decapitate their leadership and so forth. That is another area that we need to continue to fund and stay on the cutting edge of. And by the way, embedded in that whole conversation is our intelligence gathering capabilities. Intelligence is a cornerstone of national security. It is based on intelligence that you make both strategic and tactical decisions. And today, because of traitors like Edward Snowden and others, we have lost access to much of the intelligence our country once had on adversaries. We know less today about our adversaries and about terrorists than we did a decade ago. And that also threatens not just the safety and security of men and women in uniform, but it threatens our ability to come up with a strategic foreign policy and a strategic defense policy. But I do think it begins by funding our capabilities, not just capabilities, but the right capabilities. And we're not doing that right now.
A word you just used triggered a thought I didn't have on a card, is the word traitor. You know, a while ago we made a swap of 5 Taliban leaders for Bo Bergdahl in the Rose Garden. Just yesterday, the President of the United States reversed arguably centuries of policy, and that we sent Marines to the shores of Tripoli to prevent the ability for terrorists to extort Americans. How do you feel about the President's decision to facilitate negotiation with terrorists?
Well, what the President said is they wouldn't prosecute, my understanding of what he said, they wouldn't prosecute families that were doing that. And look, I don't think anybody here thinks we were going to do that. I know the Sotlaw family, for example. They have roots in New Hampshire as well. And their son was murdered by ISIS, and it's a heartbreaking situation. They live in Florida now. They live not far from my home. And you put yourself in the place of these families, they feel helpless, and we're not going to prosecute them or put them in jail. But here's the problem with trades like the one you discussed. And that is, you have now put a price on an American life. You've now told terrorists 1 American serviceman equals at least 5 terrorists. And you've now almost incentivized them to go out and capture people in uniform because they and take them hostage because they know they can get something in return. In essence, you haven't prevented it, you've actually heightened the prospect of that happening. And I'm not telling you these are not difficult situations, they're extremely difficult at the human level. And our heart breaks for these families that are going through these things. But you have, in essence, potentially put in danger other servicemen and women who now have a price tag assigned to them as a result of these negotiations and as a result of these measures that the President's taking.
All right, last question, then we'll open it up. You've talked about defense and defense capabilities. Obviously requires defense spending. We've also heard military leaders like Admiral Mullen and General Mattis talk about debt and deficits as the single greatest threat that we face. Can you be both a defense hawk and a deficit hawk?
Yes.
And how do you do that?
Because defense spending is not the reason why we have a long-term debt problem. Our long-term debt problem is driven by